James, great to see you. I've been following you for a long time, so I'm honored to be able to have this conversation now.
Ryan, I'm so excited to be here. I love the name of your podcast also, Order of Man.
What resonates with you about it? What do you like about it?
I feel like the word order of implies not only just a kind of demographic, but that there's a code of values that one should live by. And I do think that whether it's traditional or evolutionary or psychological or just something stupid, men and women both live by different codes of values and ideals. And again, some of that might be commercially focused or focused by parents or school or education or bosses, or jobs. But it has happened. You can't deny it.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
And you
That's
want to
part
be
of
the
the
best
reason we
person
did
you
that.
could be. So I want to be I don't necessarily want to um, follow blindly the code established by 3 billion people, but it gives me sort of a sense of, where I'm different and where I'm the same, and which pieces I like and which pieces I don't, and so on.
Yeah,
That
you
might have been a
actually hit
long
on.
answer to why I
No,
like the name of your
I'm
podcast.
always curious. You actually hit on both reasons. Order, obviously, just some sort of fraternal organization, a collection of people, right? But then creating order and structure and having that code that you talked about and shared values. But the system is important, and I like that you've created a lot of systems in your life for making sure that you're being creative, that you're exercising and flexing that muscle. It's funny because so many people think that creativity has to be entirely spontaneous. But the thing I liked about, especially with your latest book, is that you almost in a way codify it and give us some real practical applications for being more creative.
Thanks for saying that. And I'm not, we could talk about anything. I'm not here to sell the book, but this book was it still had my usual stories and experiences and a lot of the experiences of, podcast guests or historical anecdotes or whatever. But this was my most practical book to date. And I really, and by practical, I don't mean what I see in a lot of books, like, oh, this scientific research says if you cross your legs and the other person crosses their legs, then you could control
Right.
This is practical in the sense that these were all techniques that have worked for me. And some of them are unusual techniques, but they've actually worked over and over and over again. And I feel they would work for others. So, and I've seen them work for others. I was happy to do this book. This might even be my last like non-fiction book or book in this style, just because it was so practical that I felt like I don't know what else to say. I might do a different type of book, but not this type of book anymore.
Did I hear, maybe as I was listening, or maybe I've heard something else, that you are contemplating writing thrillers? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, I
Okay,
would
that's
like.
what I
I
thought. I wondered
really
if I made
love.
that up or really heard that.
When I was younger, I used to really love like beautiful literary fiction, and I still do. Like if and there, there's lots of different definitions of literary fiction. I have my own, but I really also love books that have no pretensions and are simply page turners. And if I learn something in them, that's great. But they're just so good at the art of storytelling. I love a book like that. Anybody who's pretentious and says, "Oh, well, I don't like John Grisham," well, they probably haven't read any John Grisham books, because they're like amazing page turners. Now, some people I don't like because I think the writing might be a little boring or not believable. You still need to be a good writer to write a
Sure.
good thriller. But a thriller has its own particular structure. A horror novel has its structure. A mystery has its structure. A science fiction novel has its structure. These are all different structures, and how you play with structure is part of the challenge of an artist.
One of the things that I like about fiction that I don't know that I would always say is that it's just intrinsically valuable. So for example, you take Skip the Line or any sort of self-help type work. It's good, it's practical, but you read it for a desired outcome. I want to learn these 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 things so I can produce better in my life. But the reason you would read fictional work is to enjoy the book, period, the end. It's just intrinsically valuable. And I think more people need to do that in their lives rather than focusing on some desired result.
Yeah, like even books like, let's say, that are fictional versions of George Washington or Abraham, like Brad Meltzer, a very good writer, wrote a book about the plot against George Washington. And it was based on this conspiracy that was going to try to assassinate George Washington. But it was still the George Washington stuff we all know about. So it gives a kind of foundation for the book that we can all relate to. But ultimately, it's got to be a good work of fiction, or I'll read a history book instead.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I made a post the other day and I said something about quote unquote staying in your lane is bad advice. And I think if there's anybody who epitomizes the idea of why staying in your lane isn't always the best route to go, it's you. From self-help type books to potentially writing a thriller to hedge fund investor and everywhere in between. And I love how many different veins and routes and avenues, and it just makes life very interesting. And I think it actually gives you a lot of edges in a very sane, kind of boring, mundane world. I think that's probably why guys like you stand out quite a bit.
It's very interesting. I've never thought of it this way, but you're right. This staying in the lane. What's a lane? Like, what are you? If you're an orthopedic surgeon, I don't even. What's orthopedic? Is that like the back or? Okay, let's say you're a podiatrist. Sure. The foot. Should you never give a medical opinion other than if it has to do with the foot, even though you went to like 8 years of medical school? It's so like the lane in the past century or the past 70 years. The lane, I'm putting it in quotes for people who aren't seeing the video, the lane has gotten more and more narrow and niche. This is a very narrow lane, and it's very easy to like crash and fall off the lane. Whereas if you're on like a 50 lane highway, you could swerve and go around different lanes, and you just learn more. Like if I know a lot about physics and I also know a lot about writing. Well, what's the intersection of that? I can write a popular physics book, which, so you have people like, Stephen Hawking, Michio Kaku, Brian Greene, Neil deGrasse Tyson, or I can write a popular science fiction novel that makes use of physics. So like Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, has some knowledge of physics and sort of many. So the idea that I should only do one thing makes for a very boring person, I think. And also there's another point there too, which Skip the Line addresses, which is that it's not very difficult to switch lanes to the point where you're in the top 1% in the world in many lanes. So whereas Stephen Hawking might be the top, when he was alive, he might have been the top physicist in the world. Take someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and this is with all respect to him. He's been on my podcast several times. I've been on his podcast. He's not in the top 10 or even 20 or even 100 physicists in the world, but he's he's certainly in the top 1% of physicists in the world, but he's in the top 1 or 2 of people who combine excellent communication skills with physics. And right. That's what makes him so special, is that he didn't stay in his lane. He didn't just try to work on some new twist of black holes and stuff like that. He became a communicator, and now he's runs the Hayden Planetarium in New York City. It's very exciting. So I think staying in the lane is the fastest route to a boring life. And I should add also, as I mentioned with Neil deGrasse Tyson, you don't need to be in the top 10 of the world. You could be in the top 1%. So what does that mean? Let's take something like chess, which got popular after the Queen's Gambit TV show on Netflix, which was about 8 months ago. Since then, there's something like 65 million people signed up for chess.com, which is an online place where you could play chess. So if you're in the top 2% of chess players in the world, that means you're in the top 1.3, that you're one of 1.3 million people. And you could still know enough that particularly if you combine it with other skills, it could propel you to play a meaningful role, whether it's as a communicator, as a writer, as a chess player, as a coach, as an instructor, as someone who uses chess skills in business. And to be in the top 1% of something doesn't require 10,000 hours. Depending on what that category is, it might take what I call experiments. Like it might take 100 experiments or less than 100 hours to be in the top 1% of a field. Like my wife recently had a parathyroidectomy. She had a surgery, which is it removed these. I never even heard of these things called parathyroids. They're next to the thyroid, which is why they're called parathyroids. And she had one that was inflamed, and they removed it. And it's not a big surgery, and many people don't know about it. But for me, as soon as she got this diagnosis, I read maybe 50 to 100 different papers on it. I spoke to doctors about it, and it's not like I could perform surgery on someone's parathyroid, but I would say I'm in the top 1% or 2% of knowledge about this. Like I asked other doctors about parathyroids, they had no clue. So unless you're an expert or me, you're probably not in the top 2% of this thing. And it was, it took a few weeks, but it was relatively straightforward.
Well, and not to mention, is it going to make life better for you? It's actually going to advance whatever's meaningful and significant to you and whatever you're chasing, because you're bringing experience and concepts and ideas from this realm, and you're bringing it over here into this realm, and it's non-traditional. And usually what happens is when somebody from the outside comes into a certain place, maybe it's chess. I don't know much about chess. People get thrown out of the loop for a minute. Like, whoa, what's going on here? And then they have to adjust, and then they get better and you get better. You talk about this concept. I think you use the term idea sex. It actually reminds me a lot of Blue Ocean Strategy. Did you ever read Blue Ocean Strategy?
No, I didn't. I know some of the concepts from it though.
Yeah, because they talk about, I think one of the examples they use is Cirque du Soleil, and they talk about combining the circus with theater to create this entirely new, uncontested market space. Very similar concept.
No, and I'll give you an odd example that just came to mind when you mentioned chess and whatever. There's a saying in chess, one way beginners get good is there are a lot of like kind of quotes or sayings that you memorize these nifty little quotes, you could get better at chess. So like one is called "The threat is stronger than the execution." So attacking, threatening to take a queen might be much stronger than actually taking the queen. So, but here's an example in real estate negotiation where the exact, I was doing a real estate negotiation recently, and the exact quote occurred to me where it was very extremely useful. So I hope this doesn't sound too wonky in the details of the negotiation, but let's say you're buying a house and you want to offer, the house is for sale for 500,000. I'm just making numbers up, and you want to offer a little lower. So here's a case where the threat is stronger than the execution, and me thinking this allowed me to do this. You can offer 400,000, but you could also have a clause that says, no matter what other offer you get, I will offer $50,000 higher. And so now they're not going to get an offer for $1 million. So I know my risk is limited, but if someone hears that an offer on the table there's an offer that includes no cap, that whatever I offer, they're going to offer $50,000 more with no cap on that. That's going to scare away. That's a threat. That's going to scare away I could offer 3 million. I don't know if they're going to offer 3,050,000, and that's going to scare away anybody else. Meanwhile, let's say someone offers 500,000. I could just say, nah, I'm out. Like I didn't sign anything that binds me to this. Sure. So it's just a negotiation. So that's a case where I have all the benefits of a bluff, but none of the downside, to use a poker analogy. But it really fits the concept of the threat is stronger than execution. I'm threatening that I could pay infinite. Nobody knows. And if they make an offer that's binding, they'll be stuck if it's too high because they're afraid of me. But I take no risk. If someone offers 3 million, I could just say, I'm out.
Never mind. That's interesting. That's one of those things. And this is one of the trends that I saw in the book you wrote is that it's almost one of those things you're not quote unquote supposed to do. And I think people get afraid of that. And it's not so much the result of that. I think a lot of the times people won't do these things they're not supposed to do, like step out of line, metaphorically, to go with the book. because they're worried about the perception from other people, not what actually might happen when you do it, but the perception that you're cutting in line or you're being inappropriate, or you're an asshole, or any number of things you think people might think of you when you do this.
Yeah, I mean, all the time, let's say you decide, oh, I'm very interested in golf. And let's say you never played golf before, but you take lessons and you improve your handicap from a 60 handicap to a 10 handicap. And then you write an article like, here's my golf experience. You could be worried that all these professional golfers are like, who is this guy? Like,
right.
he's nothing. He's no good. But who cares what they think? Like when I wrote this book, Skip the Line, I was writing not a lot, but I had in 2015, like it was about 6 years ago, I started doing very actively stand-up comedy. Like I'd perform 5 times a week. And when I was writing this, I was writing a little bit about my experiences getting better. And I was thinking, oh, comedians are going to hate this. They're going to think, who's this guy to be writing about? But who cares? Like, that's a group of 50 people that I might be worried about. It's a huge world. These are valuable experiences that inform on all types of learning. And, I think the source of much unhappiness is worrying about what people think of you. Now, don't get me wrong. I do worry about what people think of me very often, but you just have to keep in mind that it's not the most important thing to worry about. And that helps dealing with it, because we all care a little bit. We're tribal animals. We care a little bit what people think of us, but having tools for dealing with that and understanding what's going on is useful.
Well, and I don't think it's actually bad to worry about what people think of you, but it has to be the right people. And I think what happens is a lot of guys end up focusing on appeasing the wrong people. Like, for example, I care about what my wife thinks of me. I care about what my children think of me. I would say most people would say that's entirely appropriate. So it isn't about not caring what anybody thinks. It's about caring what the right people think. But I am curious on your stand-up comedy, with that thought, as you were going into it 5 or 6 years ago, what was the actual reception from your peers, those in the industry already?
Yeah. And by the way, it's interesting. You mentioned the wife and the kids. It's almost like there's concentric circles of care. So like wife, kids might be was the tightest circle around you. And then the rest of your family is the next circle. So like siblings, parents, cousins, their opinion's important to you, but it might not be as important. And if they disagree, if you have too many fights with them, maybe you need to take a break from them, whereas you're not going to take a break from your kids or wife or whatever. And then there's your friends, then coworkers, then community, then society, then social media, which is, I separate that from society because it's a little more anonymous, and on and on. Who knows what other circles are in between. And even in coworkers, there's different types of coworkers. There's your boss, and there's people who work in the next building, but they're still coworkers. And with comedy, first off, my friends thought I was crazy. They're like, hey, we already know you're funny. Why do you need to go on stage in front of 30 people and tell jokes? And that was an interesting question, because what was I satisfying some emotional hole that I had, or what was going on? And I had to think about it. But my peers, the comedians, particularly the ones who had been doing it for 20 years, but hadn't really found, they were super funny, but they might not have found huge financial success, because there's a luck factor in that, in things like comedy. And they were very upset. They were like, this guy, literally, they told me, or what, I remember specifically one guy, but many people said this. One guy said to me, you can't skip the line. You got to pay your dues. I've been doing this for 20 years. You don't even find your voice until you've been doing this for 10 years. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't want to, I'm at the time I was like in my mid 40s or something. I don't want to wait 10 years to find my voice. I've been doing writing and public speaking for 20 years. I don't need another 10 to find my voice here. And I'm, so meanwhile, he's telling me this 30 seconds before I'm about to go on stage. So, he had an agenda, and you have to just put everything in context. Like, he was giving good advice that in general, it's a very difficult skill, and respect the skill. But in terms of his own personal timeline, he was projecting that onto me. And maybe he cared about me a little bit, but also he was worried he didn't want me to pass him because he's been doing it for 20 years and he wants success. And maybe just was jealous that I was going to be able to do it. I'm not saying that in a bad way. Maybe he wasn't jealous, or, it's almost a cliche to say, oh, when someone hates you, they're jealous, but sometimes they truly are.
Sure. Yeah. The concept of the 10,000 hour rule always, I won't say it rubbed me wrong, but it didn't sit quite right with me, because what I thought of, and you opened my eyes to some new considerations, which we'll get into. But when I thought of it, I'm like, well, okay, 10,000 hours, but not all 10,000 hours are the same. Like if I was doing 10,000 hours of nonsense towards something, it wouldn't be nearly as effective as being fully committed, heart, mind, soul into the thing and putting everything into each one of those hours. But then you unlocked it even further and said, hey, forget about the quality of the hours. Like, what if we just change it to experiments and we can skip the line and we don't have to wait 7 years or whatever that equates to, and we can experience those results a whole lot quicker, which I think everybody wants.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the whole nature of an experiment is you have a theory about something and maybe you don't know the answer, but maybe all of society doesn't know the answer. Because if you have a theory about something, in most cases, you could just look it up on Google and find out your answer. So doing an experiment on even a field that millions of people are involved in might improve your understanding of that field in ways that nobody else understands. Do you do enough experiments, you could legitimately claim to be in the top 1 or 2% of knowledge, or at least ready to have idea sex or possibility sex with another field that you're familiar with. And again, the 10,000 hour rule, whether or not it's even true, it really refers to, I want to be the best in the world. Like, I want to be let's say someone wants to be the best tennis player and they're 8 years old. They need to put 10,000 hours in, more or less, to be, to win Wimbledon, if assuming they have some talent. Now, some people argue there's no such thing as talent, but let's say there is such thing as talent. Assuming they have talent and they put in 10,000 hours of what's called deliberate practice, maybe they'll win Wimbledon. But to be the kind of tennis player who could beat all your friends, you don't need 10,000 hours. Maybe you experiment with a type of serve that has this weird backspin on it,
right,
that you master after 12 hours of practice or 50 hours of practice. It's an experiment. If I do this weird backspin that not a single coach in the world would recommend, but it's really hard to get, and you mix it up with some other spinning serves, you might be able to beat all of your friends at the club. And that's good enough. And you'll learn enough. And then you read a book, The Inner Game of Tennis, and maybe you experiment on your backhand, and boom, suddenly you're in the top 1%, which means you're probably one of 10 million people, probably close to 1 billion people know how to play tennis. And it's good enough to beat all your friends and family, which, that might be your goal. Yeah. It also depends on what your goal is too.
That's right. That's the point. It's like, what is it that you want? What are you after? Most people can't really answer that question.
I had an experience, and I might've written about it in the book, but it kind of really opened my eyes a lot to this idea of being in the top 1% or 2% rather than being in the top 10 of the world. And I was in a taxi cab, and, I was just making conversation. The driver was from Turkey, and I said, "Oh, what'd you do in Turkey?" And he's like, "Well, I love playing chess. I play chess." And so I know we're talking a lot about chess, but it's something I do. And I figured, okay, he's like, maybe he knows the rules and he plays for fun or whatever. But he said, yeah, I was the champion of Turkey. I was the national champion of Turkey.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh, what's your ranking? And he told me his ranking, and it was, it was like a standard deviation above my ranking, meaning he could probably beat me 2 out of 3 times if we were to play a match. But it took him an extra, to get to that level, it would take an extra 4 or 5 years of where I am now to reach his level. So he must have put in 4 or 5 years of studying at least 3 to 5 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I'm not saying it's bad that he's driving a cab, but chess helped me get into college. It helped me get my first job. It helped me get into graduate school. It helped me raise money when I was raising money, because people associate chess with a certain level of intelligence and discipline and so on. So just reaching the master level of chess, I achieved my goal to help me be successful in business, as opposed to being what's called an international master of chess, which nobody knows the difference, and spending an extra 4 or 5 years doing that.
Well, there's that law of diminishing returns, right? If you dabble into things, you're talking about chess. When you say chess, I mean, I'm really hearing jujitsu because that's something I've started to do over the past couple of years. And the concept is similar. If I go in and I take 6 months of training or even a year of training, I'm probably going to be capable of defending myself or beating 95% or more of the population. Now, if I want to beat the other 5%, it's going to take me 20 years or longer to get to that point where I can hang with a 5. But the 95, I got covered after a year.
Well, let me even give another. Let's take jiu-jitsu as an example. I don't know what the ranking system's like. Are there color belts? Is that
belt system? Yeah, it's a belt system.
So let's say there's an 8th degree black belt and a 1st degree black belt. If I were looking at them fighting equals to them, like if I was looking at the 8th degree black belt fight the 1st degree black belt, I could see who's better. But if I'm looking at both these people playing, fighting their equals, I would not be able to tell with my amateur eyes. I would not be able to tell who was better. It would not. They would both look like the best in the world to me. I wouldn't be able to tell if they were in the top 5 people in the world or in the top 10% in the world. It would mean nothing to me. And like you say, though, it would take an extra X number of years to go from 1st degree black belt to 8th degree or 10th degree black belt. And so it's not even important in most areas of life to be the best to achieve certain goals. If you said to me, oh, you're a black belt in jiu-jitsu, I'm equally impressed as if you said you were a 10th degree black belt in jiu-jitsu.
Right.
And again, your goal might not be to impress me, but maybe it's to be able to defend yourself against large category of the population, B, impress coworkers, friends, whatever, about your work and ethic and discipline and your fighting abilities and your physical shape. And, why do you have to be in the top 10 in the world? You're getting a lot of play. You can enjoy jiu-jitsu for the rest of your life now without being, the best in the world, which might not be so enjoyable. And, there's a lot of benefits to being in the top 1% of something rather than the top 10 of all people.
Well, I think there's another benefit. It's interesting we're talking about this because I think we're both in this self-development, self-help space in one form or the other. And these aren't conversations you hear a lot. Like, you don't need to be the best. But I thought about this when I started podcasting about 6 years ago. I looked at what Joe Rogan was doing and I thought, I want to have a podcast that's bigger than Joe Rogan's. And that was my naiveness speaking, my ignorance about what it takes speaking at the time. And I started podcasting and doing the things and got a couple of years and a couple hundred podcasts under my belt. And then I realized I actually don't want that because there's other things that I want. I want to be here with my family. I want to go on hunts. I want to participate in this. I want to explore these interests and these activities and these hobbies. And if I want to be the best, I could pursue that, but I'm going to have to sacrifice a lot of other things that I want in order to have that thing I thought at the time I wanted.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good comment because look, I'm a podcaster. We all look at Joe Rogan as, man, first off, he has incredible skills. His interviews aren't interviews. They seem like conversations. I can't tell the difference between an interview and just a great conversation among intelligent friends with him.
Agreed.
And he does like 9 episodes a week, some outrageous number. And he's worked really hard at it for over a dozen years. And on top of that, he's super talented. He's been a TV actor or a comedian, a MMA fighter. So he's interesting. But here's where experiments, and again, there's a spectrum of skills in podcasting, like how good is one at having a conversation, how good is one at, keeping the story going and the flow going and so on. There's some skills, but here's where experiments are interesting. What if the Joe Rogan arena is too crowded, which it might be? Well, okay, let's think of a different format for a podcast. What if I were to call a random phone number and whoever answers, I'm recording it, and my goal is to have one crazy, insane story before the end of the hour just by calling random phone numbers.
That's interesting.
And I'm just making this up. That's an experiment. Sure. And if that experiment works, then you might have the most popular podcast in the world from just one experiment. If that experiment doesn't work, who cares? Then you don't do it. And you wasted one day and you learned something about a bunch of random people. Plus you learned something about podcasting. Plus you got over kind of maybe fears of calling people cold. You learn so many things, even when you fail at an experiment. And if the downside was zero, no money, very little time, and you learn something. The upside is infinite. Like, it's incredible. You could have a podcast at Joe Rogan's level if that experiment works.
Well, I think what doing experiments is it giving you permission to just start something. Because one of the common comments and questions that I receive is, I want to start this podcast, or I want to do this thing, or I want to grow this business, but I don't know where to start. And as I was listening to you talk about it in the book, I'm like, this is it. This is where you start. You just do little experiments that have tremendous upside potential, limited downside risk, and you just start. You just do something. It doesn't have to be the ideal version. You just test it to see if it's going to work. And if it does, you take one more experiment after that.
Yeah. I the other day, someone was telling me, I'd like to start doing YouTube videos, but I need to, it's really expensive equipment. I need to price it out, get like production assistant and all that. And I'm like, look at your phone.
Right.
Your phone has a better video camera on it than what Martin Scorsese used or Francis Ford Coppola used to shoot The Godfather. Like, that shouldn't be holding you back. And a lot of times,
excuse, I think, a lot of times.
Yeah, it's an excuse because maybe they're not ready yet, or maybe they're afraid, or maybe I don't know what. Sometimes that happens to me. I come up with excuses. It usually means you don't really want to do something. Like, if you really want to do something, you just go do it.
Right.
If I really wanted to write, even like writing a thriller, I say I want to write a thriller. If I really wanted to write a thriller, I would just sit down today. I'd wake up a half hour early and write the first 3 pages of it.
Yeah, it's definitely true that if you wanted it, you would just do it. You would get after it. You'd have no problems. And not use that as an excuse to not move forward. I want to go back to something you said earlier, because it caught me, and I thought about it for a second. You said some people don't believe in the idea of talent. I've actually never heard that before. I've never heard that concept. I've never heard anybody say that. I'm really curious where that comes from.
Well, so the guy Malcolm Gladwell popularized the concept of the 10,000 hour rule in the book Outliers.
Right.
But he was really just documenting the research done by this one guy, Professor Anders Ericsson, who's a very good guy. He recently, or past few years ago, he passed away. But he's the one who really did all the experiments and research to develop the 10,000 hour rule. And his concept was, if you spend 10,000 hours, give or take a couple of thousand hours of what's called deliberate learning, which is you do something, a coach gives you feedback, you do it again. So there's a lot of repetition, a lot of feedback, and from a coach who's better, and that's deliberate practice.
Sure.
And you 10,000 hours of that, he says you'll be the best in the world, or among the best in the world. And he did not believe at all in talent. So, for instance, he would train people to win the world or U.S. memory championship. How many numbers in a row can you memorize? And he, the people he taught using his theories broke every world record in memory. And his argument was none of these people had any more talent than anybody else. He picked random people and he taught them to break world records in memory. And he noticed the same patterns occurred in a lot of other fields, although it's hard to really scientifically test many other fields. And so he did not believe in talent at all, unless in basketball, if you're only 4 feet tall, you're probably not going to be an NBA player. There's some natural limitations.
Yeah, but that may not be a talent as much as just a characteristic. It's something different than I imagine a talent would be.
Right.
Just your height, for example.
And so I think in that, area of call it research or whatever, there what is talent in poker, for instance? Some people are incredibly good at poker and some aren't. Is there talent in poker, or is there skill? Is there talent in math? Is there skill in math? Because some part of poker is being able to calculate statistics really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you spend 10,000 hours really focusing on statistics and other skills required for poker, you'd probably be the best in the world at poker. And I don't even know what talent means in poker. Does that mean you have an ability to sense what cards other people have? It turns out that's not really such an important skill in poker. And yet this is a skill set that can make people a lot of money if they're good at it. So
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know where I fall on this either.
Right. No, it's just an interesting concept. And as you talk about it, my knee-jerk reaction is, well, yes, there's talent. Some people are more talented than others. You can train somebody to beat that talent, but imagine what you could do if you take somebody who's naturally inclined or gifted and then teach them the right skill sets. Would that magnify them more than they could have gone on talent or skill development alone?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the accurate way to think about it. Like, if let's say I'll take the area of chess again. Let's say you're 11 years old and you're incredibly strong at chess. There's got to be some talent involved. There's got to be some part of your brain that is clear enough to see lots of things that other people don't see on the board. I mean, it's a very complicated game. It takes decades to be great at it. But I know one guy who, when I was younger, I was in my 20s. My roommate's brother was probably the most talented chess player in world history. Like, he was unbelievable. He was 11 years old and he was just crushing every grandmaster at speed chess, like when you play fast. And when he would explain games to me, it sounded like I was talking to like an adult instead of an 11-year-old. But then he didn't get the right training, or maybe he couldn't handle losing when he played in actual tournaments. But by the time he was like a teenager, he basically stopped playing, and he couldn't move beyond a certain level. So developing the skill, even though there was talent, developing the skill was a lot more important. Now, what if somebody has no talent? Can they ever develop the skill? I don't know. Maybe you need a little bit of talent. I do know some people who weren't that talented who became incredibly good with hard work.
I guess it really just depends on if it interests you or not. Like, there's so many different things to. This 11-year-old, for example,
Spanish, you're never going to learn Spanish.
Right. Or this 11-year-old, maybe he's incredibly gifted, talented, whatever you want to call it. And, he just doesn't like chess anymore. And that's it. So, okay, find something else.
I think when you love something, you are able to remember the nuances a lot better. So let's say you don't really like golf, but all your coworkers play golf. So you take a few lessons, and let's say you have a really good coach. So you learn the correct swing, you learn how to hold your feet, you learn how to, hold the golf club, and which club's good for which situation. But if you're not really that interested in it, you're not going to remember, hold your feet at this angle, and you use this club for this, and when there's a wind, here's how you might not remember all the what's called chunks. So every skill is, let's say, divided into 100,000 chunks. So in poker, you remember if someone raises and then re-raises and you have a pair of aces, you might want to go out. You might want to just fold. So that's like a chunk, whereas if somebody doesn't know that chunk, they might re-raise again with a pair of aces because they have the best hand, or who knows. And I'm making that up. I might have described a bad way to play, but
somebody's going to correct us, I'm sure.
Yeah. So poker players, they'll definitely correct. Oh, this guy doesn't know anything. But so every skill is like almost the language of these nuances, and you just might not, if you're not interested in it, you're not going to remember. If you're not interested in math, you might not remember the quadratic equation or whatever, or how to calculate an integral. I don't know. So you have to really love something.
Well, and I think a lot of those things, if you do have a love for it, it would be even hard for you to explain. So people on the outside will look at it and say, for example, Joe Rogan, Joe Rogan, you're so good at this. And you say, well, why are you good at this? And I bet if you asked him that question, would have a very hard time articulate. What do you mean? Like, can't everybody just have a conversation? Can't everybody just do it like this? He might have a hard time articulating what makes him so great at it.
That's a really good point. Like, sometimes people who are the best in the world are maybe the poorest teachers because they learned when they were really young, and they don't really, maybe they had a lot of talent, like you say. And so the work that was required for them was different than the kind of work required for someone who's 40 and just starting golf, compared to the work of someone who's 8 and starting golf, that's completely different work. There's a completely different skill set. So someone who learned to be a great golf player, but who started at the age of 8 might not be good at teaching someone who's 40 and has already built a lot of their physical habits and now needs to unlearn things and learn the correct habits. Like this person's had all these good habits for 32 years. He might not understand what the requirements are. But that said, by dividing a skill, I kind of go through this a little in the book by dividing a skill into micro skills and doing these experiments, you could kind of, start figuring out what your learning needs are versus someone who did something at 8. I mean, my book's really focused to someone who's suddenly falls in love with computer programming at the age of 28. What do? Someone who started at the age of 6 might not be able to tell them. And I've been a programmer. A lot of programmers are weird. They may not just have the skills of teaching. And so, there's a lot of different nuances in learning. But my book is geared for the adult improver who really wants to be in the top 1% of whatever they love. And it's difficult, but not impossible. The other thing about loving what you do is every day we start off with a limited amount of energy. That's why at the end of the day, we're tired and we need to sleep to rejuvenate. So when you learn something, you need energy to learn and to do the thing. Let's say you want to write a book. You need energy to write the book. Now, if part of the energy you spend is because you have to convince yourself to sit down and start typing because you don't really love it as much as John Grisham loves it, then you're not going to be able to beat the people who love it. It's going to be harder for you to be in the top 1 or 2% of something because a good 20% of your energy is going to be spent every day just convincing yourself to do something you don't love.
Yeah, but here's the beauty of this, especially in the world that we live in. You don't have to be a New York Times bestselling author to have a large influence, to impact a lot of people, to make a lot of money. You don't have to have this kind of podcast. You don't have to pursue that certain avenue. There are an infinite number of routes that you can go where you think, I don't want to write a book. Cool, don't write a book. You can still reach your goals doing it a different way.
Yeah, or like take jiu-jitsu as an example. If you did a podcast where all you did was interview 10th degree black belts in jiu-jitsu, you would have a very loyal, committed audience, like extremely loyal. They would be highly engaged in your podcast. They would join the Facebook group you set up about your podcast. They would discuss the different people you interviewed and what else you could have asked and what the people said and how it applies to them. Extremely loyal, but it'd be 1/1000th the audience of Joe Rogan's podcast. But you wouldn't care because you love it and you love the people you interview and the audience is engaged with you. And you might even make money because you'll have, people who make jujitsu products might see how loyal your audience is. And so they'll sponsor your podcast more than if you have like a general podcast that's trying to compete with Joe Rogan.
Right.
And by the way, you don't want to write a book, but let's say you do 10 episodes interviewing 10th degree black belts. Well, now you have an audiobook. Just combine them all together, do some basic audio editing, maybe record an intro you do for each thing. And now you just quote unquote wrote an audiobook.
Right. That's an experiment. Another experiment along that line would be having a ghostwriter take all of those, get them transcribed by some audio equipment for $100, and then have somebody clean it all up for you. And all of a sudden you have your words in written format. There's an experiment. It didn't cost you a lot of time or money, high upside potential, low downside risk. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but you figure out some things along the way.
Right. Absolutely. You'll learn about the publishing process. You'll have your go-to set of people for doing the editing, doing cover design, uploading it to Amazon. And then at the very least, you have your core audience that's very engaged and loyal to you who will buy the book in some form or other. And and then let's say you want to go on another podcast or you want to speak at a TED Talk. Well, if they're choosing between the guy who wrote a book and the guy who didn't write a book, they're going to choose the person who wrote a book. And like you said, you don't have to actually write it. I mean, James Patterson doesn't even write his books anymore. You always see James Patterson with, and it's a great kind of experiment, actually.
Where a lot of men get hung up is they think that if they pursue one path, they believe they're pigeonholing themselves into this path. And what I like about what you've been talking about the last little while and in the book is you're almost giving these guys permission. They didn't need it, but in a way, giving them permission to say, look, you can go down this route, just take the first small step, and then you can pivot. You can adjust. You don't have to pigeonhole yourself like maybe you did 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago when you pursued a career path in the corporate world. It's different now, and we ought to treat it differently.
Yeah. And, also not every lane or skill or domain is equal. So for instance, I'll because you're into jiu-jitsu, I'll keep using that as an example, but it could apply to anything. That might take 2 decades to reach your full potential, or 10 years or 15 years, who knows? But let's say you're an accountant. Now, accounting is also a skill, and it's a reasonably hard skill. Like if you love it and you study it, there's lots of nuances in the laws. You have to know 600,000 pages of tax law and really get good at it. So a good accountant is significantly better than a bad accountant. But at some point, there's a cap to how good you're going to be at accounting. And there's not that many use cases per person. You file taxes once a year, and, some people get in trouble and some don't, and you have to be able to help them. But now let's say you're also interested in sports. Well, the nuances of how sports figures, they get endorsements, they get, their salary. Maybe they are occasionally get sued for various reasons. And so their nuances might be different. So you can combine your interest in sports with your interest in accounting and keep learning, as opposed to just going into work, doing the same things every day, and, just kind of giving up except for making a salary. And then maybe you pursue your interests on the weekends. You can always bring your interests into your work. And then that makes work something that you love, and you learn more and more, and you become among the best at what you're doing, because you're in multiple lanes, learning how to combine them, learning the nuances, and so on.
Well, you also give yourself more opportunity because, I think the example you used was Jesse Itzler in the book, and you talked about him writing rap songs and wanting to perform, but that wasn't working out, and then he started, if I understand correctly, writing songs for sports teams, and then he now he owns a team, right? So
yeah,
you can get yourself into a world that you're interested in, a non-traditional route. Maybe that route's not working, but you could still be very close to that world if you're willing to experiment and look at different veins and different avenues to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Jesse Itzler is a great example. Like, he was never going to be a world famous professional rapper, but by being in the top 1% of all rappers and understanding business and sports, he was able to approach football teams, baseball teams, whatever, and say, listen, I run a company that makes nifty hip hop songs about your team, and you could play it and the fans will cheer, and they'll have a fun time and they'll buy more tickets and so on. And so he did it for basically every sports team and sold the company for millions. It's like he invented a field that didn't exist before by combining his interest in music and sports, and boom. And then, like you say, now he's made enough money, and his wife has made enough money that they own the Atlanta Hawks.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty incredible. When you talk about all these ideas and these experiments, I know one thing that you do as a daily practice is writing down as many ideas. I think it's 10, I think you said, every day that you come up with. My question is if you're encouraging other people to do this and they're doing this, how do you know which ideas are worth pursuing and which ones aren't? Because clearly you can't do all of them. So How do you decide to choose one or a handful?
Like if you write 10 ideas, so I always think it's important to not stop until you have 10 ideas on the paper. And so people ask me, well, what kind of ideas are they? Are they ideas for businesses, ideas for books? Maybe. It could be ideas for, how Ryan could improve his podcast. It could be ideas for Google. It could be ideas, what are the TV series from the 90s that influenced me the most? Those are ideas, because that could turn into at least an article if I want to. And so but if you have 3,650 ideas a year, almost all of them might be bad. The key is to write lots of bad ideas, so it just gets the muscle exercise. Like when you do push-ups, there's two things. One is you don't stop when you have one good push-up, you just keep doing it. And not every the quality of every push-up might not be good. None of your push-ups might be good from a gym coach, a physical trainer's point of view.
And you don't even stop when you're tired. That's actually when you keep going. You still need to keep doing it.
Right. And it's the same thing with these ideas. Like even now for me, when I'm doing these 10 ideas a day, and I've been doing this for 20 years, around idea number 7 or 8, like I was doing an idea list this morning and I was churning through it and I thought I had 10. I counted up. I only had 8. And it was really hard. Like that's when your brain sweats and really your neurons build in those last 2. Otherwise, you're not improving the muscle. But how do you decide what to work on? Well, the next day when you're writing ideas, you might have a slim memory of one of the ideas you wrote the day before, and you might say, that was a pretty cool idea. Maybe I'll write 10 ways I can execute that idea. Or, let's say, I have an idea for, let's say the one day I write 10 ideas for thrillers. And most of them are bad. But then the next day, I think, one of them might be good. Well, maybe I'll write my idea list for that day might be 10 chapter titles for the one idea I like from the day before. And then I might lose interest. And the next day, the idea list is about something completely different. So, I mean, I had an idea a week or so ago that I thought was good enough. It was one idea among 10 and it was related to businesses. And the next day I wrote, it was like a website type of business. And so the next day I wrote, okay, here's the 10 pages and how they would look and what they would, how they would look in a database. I'm a programmer at heart. So I wrote, and then the next day was 10 ways I can get this done and market it and make money from it. And, you just keep going. Or yesterday I was talking to somebody who has an app going up in the Apple store. Actually, it just went live yesterday while we were talking. And I was kind of, pushing him a little bit to come up with more ideas. Like, so he was asking me like, what sort of business model? Should I do a free trial or should I charge? And I'm like, well, let's think about it. There's lots of things you could do. You could do a time free trial. You could do a usage free trial. Like if you read 3 articles, then they have to pay after that. You could do constantly free, but advertising, or you could have people promote themselves. He had a very specific type of app to help people get more Instagram followers. Well, you could also get Instagram accounts to pay you to show up on the feeds for all these people who, it's complicated as that, but we were just coming up with 10 ideas for what sort of business model he could have. My final conclusion, though, was don't even think about business model. Just launch, make it free, and get as many users as possible. Then think about business model. So sometimes people think about too many things in advance.
That's what I was going to say. It sounds to me as you're thinking about all these ideas, you're documenting 365 or 3,065, ideas a year. Do people get caught in this idea loop where it's just idea? It's like, great, you've got a whole freaking binder of ideas. Like, which one of those have you implemented? Oh, no, and I'm just thinking about it. Well, okay, like you got to do something at some point.
At some point, if you have an idea that's good, again, you might not have one for years that's good, or you might have 10 in 1 year, and you never know what's going to happen. Like I had an idea. I heard a really interesting or an interview on the radio that really intrigued me. And I thought, oh, the guy who's doing the interview, he did a really good job here. And he said something that really resonated with me. So I wrote him, I said he should take that one thing he said and make it into a book. And my idea list that day was the 10 chapters that would be in that book. And I sent him this list. I don't really know him that well. He was on my podcast once, and we don't know each other that well, but I had his email address. So I sent him, and I said specifically, I don't need, if you do this, I don't need to be involved. This is just an idea. I said, you should do this for these reasons. And I sent him the outline of the book. And I said, you don't even need to contact me or anything. This is just my practice of the day. And he wrote back to me instantly. He said, James, this is great. Can you do it with me? And I'm like, no. This is really for you. Like, this would be great for you. Like it'll really make your voice in a different arena and so on. But he said, well, can you at least help me flesh it out a little more? And I said, sure, it's no problem. And so I did that. And then his team got involved and they wanted me to help them pitch it to Amazon. And then Amazon bought it and they wanted me to do the first parts of it. And I said, I'll help you, but my name doesn't need to be involved or anything. I just like helping. And ultimately I was doing enough that we had a best-selling audiobook, original. Audible's doing Audible originals. We had a best-selling Audible original that came out in March because I made this idea list and sent it to him as an experiment. I send sometimes. That never would have happened if I don't write 10 ideas a day down.
Well, what I like about this too is this is the ultimate measure of adding value to people's lives. Because I'll have a lot of guys will say, you know, how I've been able to get in touch with James and Jocko and all these other guys you've had on the podcast. And to me, it's just, if I can add value, then I'm going to try to present that value and make it valuable to other people. But so many people say, well, I don't have anything valuable to add. And there's a perfect example of just sending somebody an email saying, here's 10 things that you should do, and it turning into something valuable for them. And then also a relationship and opportunity for you as well. Yeah.
Like one time, and I do this quite a bit, but one time I sent Amazon in their self-publishing group, I sent them, here's 10, this is like in 2014 or 2012, I forget what year. And I sent them, here's 10 ideas for how you can improve the way you're doing self-publishing. Because they were just getting into self-publishing then. Mm-hmm. And they wrote back, and it was just kind of an informal note back. You know, the main person wrote back and said, oh, this is great. Let us know if you're in Seattle at any point, and we'd love to, you know, show you around and show you what we're working on. And I wrote back and said, well, it just so happens I'm going to be in Seattle next week. Could I stop by? I had never been to Seattle in my life, and I had no plans on going to Seattle. But once Amazon said that, the heads of their self-publishing division, right. I booked a ticket.
I'm going to be there.
Yeah. And then I got the tour and I got to see all the new products that they hadn't released yet, but they were working on. And then the next time I self-published a book, they were more than happy to help me, you know, figure out how to promote it and all this stuff. So it was all good.
Yeah. So many opportunities come from that. And I think that's really what everybody wants, is they want the opportunities. And one of the things that really stood out as I was listening to your book was that it's up to you to create the opportunities. It's on you to do it. It's on you to do the exercise. It's on you to take initiative. Nobody's going to think of your ideas for you or even execute on them. You have to do them yourself.
Completely. And you just never know how it's going to help you. You never know. And like, again, at the worst cases, it just improves your creativity muscle, which people think, oh no, I need to be in Paris by the riverbank and in order to paint, because that's when inspiration will hit me. No, it won't. You need to just start painting in your closet. Right. And then if you get used to, you know, if you practice painting 1,000 bad paintings, you'll start to, I mean, Picasso created over 60,000 works of art, but we maybe know 3 or 4 of them. Like same thing with Andy Warhol and other great artists, or Isaac Asimov wrote over 500 books, and we know the Foundation series and I, Robot. So you just never, it's a quantity game, creativity actually, and your quality builds up as you build the muscle.
One of the things I do, James, is because people will ask me occasionally, you know, Ryan, how do you come up with your podcast topics and the things that you want to address, and where do your ideas come from? And this is what I do. I think you'd appreciate this. I have just my notepad on my phone, and I have all kinds of notes, from different taglines to books I want to read, to t-shirt ideas, to group posts I want to make in our Facebook group, to podcast ideas. Every time I have an idea, or maybe something, I'm taking notes for this conversation, you'll say something, I'm like, oh, I actually need to talk about that deeper, and that will become a podcast episode. And I've got thousands and thousands of topics in here, and I probably won't use more than a handful of them, but they're all in there, and I'm never worried about running out of ideas because they're abundant.
Well, you know, that's an important thing of never worrying about running out of ideas. And a lot of people, like, let's say I tell an idea to a friend of mine, and I say, oh, maybe we should do this. And my friend, let's say my friend says, okay, but don't tell anybody else. We don't want anyone stealing the idea. Like, you know, on the one hand, Like they might even say this idea is worth millions. Don't tell anybody. So on the one hand, they sound like they have an abundance complex, like they want to make millions and they think this is a good idea and they're positive enough to want to try it. But actually, what they're really expressing is a scarcity complex. They're really saying that they have so few good ideas that when they hear one, don't tell anyone else or people will steal it. Like, my philosophy is always to do the exact opposite of that, is to share as many ideas as possible, even tell the ideas I'm working on that I really am spending money and taking seriously. Because first off, if someone does the idea better than me, power to them. If someone does the idea equal to me, it forces me to be my best. And chances are, anyway, I'm going to not do the idea, even if I talk about it a lot.
Right.
So I might as well share it. And finally, I know I'm going to have other ideas that are even better in the future because I'm writing ideas all the time. So that's an abundance complex. I know if I need it, I'll always come up with ideas. Now, there was a point recently where I was a little burnt out. And for the first time in like 20 years, I wasn't doing my idea list for a month or two. And it really affected me. My creativity went straight down, and it only got back up when I started redoing these idea lists again. And it was very, very important.
That's interesting. Well, I know you've been talking about it for a long time, and I've heard about it for a long time, but frankly, I've never implemented it in my own life outside of, the notes I keep here. But I'm going to start doing that. I'm going to commit to writing out these ideas daily and just see how I feel and see what I can create. I'm really excited about that.
Any one of your listeners who writes 10 ideas a day, I would say within 2-3 weeks, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, they'll actually feel their brain expanding. Like you're literally increasing the connections between neurons in the brain. And then when you start doing what I call idea sex, like, oh, here's hip hop and here's sports. What are the 10 ways hip hop and sports can be combined to make a business? Boom, that's idea sex. And you start coming up with ideas like that. One time I did an experiment. I was in a room. I was giving a talk. I had everybody write their 10 ideas down and then turn to their neighbor and combine all your ideas with their ideas to come up with a mutual list. And idea sex was, the ideas were phenomenal that came out of that. I wish I had saved them because now I don't remember really a lot of them, but they were fascinating, the results.
Yeah, I bet they would be. Well, James, I appreciate you. I want to know where we need to direct the guys to learn more about what you're doing, some of these concepts, and of course, pick up the book as well.
Yeah, well, the book Skip the Line, and if you like it, and I hope you do, write a review, or if you have any questions, you can email me at altucher@gmail.com, and hopefully I respond. I'm always terrified when someone tells me, oh, I emailed you once. Most of the time, it's hard for me to respond. I'm not a big emailer, but fortunately, every time someone says it to me, they say, oh, you responded, and I feel really relieved. But
what I gathered from the book is that in the next 7 years or so, I'll hear back from you on an email I sent 7 years earlier.
Yeah. Well, that's a good technique too, is I'll go back 7 years in my email and I'll respond to somebody as if they had just sent me that email a minute earlier. Like, sure, let's meet for coffee. How about tomorrow? And they're always like, whoa, that's the longest response delay I've ever had. And so it's always starts off with, you want to always start things off with a story. Like, so that's like a story. And, I write all my notes and idea lists on waiter's pads. So when I go to a meeting, people are with their Moleskine, $200 notebooks and their Mont Blanc pens, and I'll have a pencil and a waiter's pad, and someone will, it becomes a story. Why do you have a waiter's pad? And it's not like an affectation, like, oh, I'm gonna, wear weird glasses or whatever, but it's just enough that it creates a story, and there's legit reasons why I do the things that I do.
Well, I think there's a good point there in the idea of being interesting, right? I think it is important that we learn, yes, how to be interested in others, but also how to be interesting. It's much more fulfilling and rewarding and profitable in your life, whether it's romantic relationships or business opportunities, if you're a more well-rounded, interesting person.
Well, and I'll add to that real quickly. One final story. It's better to be the only than to be the best. So I had one of my daughters apply to all of her favorite colleges a couple years ago, and she didn't get into them. And I said, okay, why don't you take a year off and I suggested some categories, do some interesting things that you wouldn't be able to do if you had been going to college. So one thing she did was, which we set, my wife and I, we set her up with this. We called around, we found the right place. She had race car driving lessons. She got her race car driving license, and she participated in an actual professional race. Guess what? She got into every single college she applied to.
Oh, yeah. Wow. That's amazing.
And I even told her I'm against kids going to college because I think college is a waste of time, but I wanted her to succeed at this thing she was trying, which is getting into the school she wanted to go to, and she did. But same school rejected her the year before. Every school rejected her the year before.
That is a great lesson. That is a really great lesson. Well, yeah. James, I appreciate you. Like I started out earlier in the conversation, I've been following you for years, and to be able to have this conversation has been a real honor. Keep up the great work. I'm excited to get this out to the guys because people are going to be inspired by what you're doing, and it's going to lead them to take action, which is what we want and what they want as well.
I hope so, Ryan. And thanks a lot for having me on the podcast. Thanks for thinking of me for this.
Thank you, brother.